A hotel maid opened room 13 and found a crying infant wrapped in silk embroidered with bloodlines. The vampire king had searched every safe house in 7 cities for his missing heir. What no one knew, the baby's mother had hidden him in the one place immortals never looked, a human budget motel. Now the maid held the key to a war she didn't understand. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Maya Chen had cleaned room 13 at the Budget Star Motel exactly 417 times in the past 3 years. And never once had she found anything more interesting than a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey or a Bible with highlighted passages about redemption. So when she pushed open the door at 11:47 on a rain-soaked November night and heard the thin wail of an infant crying, her first thought was that someone had left a television on, except the room was dark except for the bedside lamp, and the sound was too raw, too immediate, too real to be coming from speakers. She stood in the doorway with her cleaning cart blocking her escape route, one hand still on the handle, and stared at the bundle of fabric on the bed, crimson silk that seemed to glow under the weak yellow light. And the crying intensified like the baby knew she was there and was begging for help in the only language it possessed. Maya's hands started shaking before she even crossed the threshold, her fingers tightening on the cart handle until her knuckles went white. Because this was not in the employee manual. This was not something she knew how to handle. This was the kind of situation that people like her, people who kept their heads down and their paychecks coming, were supposed to avoid at all costs. She forced herself to step inside anyway, pulling the cart in behind her and letting the door swing shut with a soft click that seemed too loud in the cramped space. And as she approached the bed, she could see the silk was old. Antique, maybe, embroidered with what looked like tree branches spreading across the fabric. In threads so dark they were almost black, and tangled in those branches were names written in a script she didn't recognize. Names that seemed to climb and spread like a genealogy chart. Except these lines were marked in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The baby was wrapped tight in the center of all those names. Just a tiny face visible above the folds of silk, skin so pale it looked almost translucent. And when Maya leaned closer, she could see the chest rising and falling in shallow breaths that seemed too slow, too faint, like the baby was barely holding on to life. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched the baby's cheek, and the skin was cold, not corpse cold but cooler than any living baby should be. And her heart lurched in her chest because what if this child was dying? What if someone had abandoned a sick infant here to die alone in this miserable room with its peeling wallpaper and the smell of industrial cleaner that never quite masked the underlying odor of mildew and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls decades ago? "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" she whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. "Who leaves a baby in a place like this?" And the baby's eyes opened. Dark eyes that seemed too aware for an infant, and locked onto her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no luggage in the room, no diaper bag, no bottles, nothing except the baby, and that strange silk and a small piece of paper pinned to the fabric near the baby's shoulder. And Maya unpinned it with shaking hands and unfolded it to read the handwritten message in flowing script that said, "Forgive me. He deserves a chance to choose." And those 8 words raised more questions than they answered, because choose what, forgive who, and why here in this terrible place where people came to disappear for a night or a week or sometimes forever? She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed her supervisor, a woman named Carol who had been working the night shift at the Budget Star for 20 years and had seen everything twice. And when Carol answered with her usual irritated sigh, Maya said, "I found a baby in room 13. And Carol said, "What kind of baby?" Like there were different categories of abandoned infants. And Maya said, "A real baby. An actual human baby. Just lying here alone." and Carol was quiet for a moment before saying, "Just call 911, Maya. Not our problem after that." And the line went dead. Maya stared at her phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call button, but before she could dial, the screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. All capitals, like someone was shouting, "Do not involve authorities. The child is mine. I am coming." And her stomach dropped, because whoever sent that message knew she was here, knew she had found the baby, and was apparently close enough to arrive soon. She spun toward the door, ears straining for footsteps in the hallway, and heard the soft scuff of shoes on worn carpet, slow and deliberate, and her mind raced through possibilities. None of them good, because people who texted in all capitals and made demands about not calling the police were not the kind of people you wanted to meet alone in a cheap motel at midnight. The baby made a soft sound, not quite a cry, more like a whimper, and Maya looked down at the tiny face and felt something shift in her chest. Some instinct she didn't know she possessed rising up and drowning out the voice that screamed at her to run, to leave, to let someone else deal with this nightmare. She reached down and gathered the baby into her arms, silk and all, and the moment she lifted the child against her chest, the crying stopped, just cut off like someone had flipped a switch, and the baby settled against her with a sigh that sounded almost relieved, and Maya felt the small body relax in increments, tension bleeding out of muscles that had been rigid with distress. The footsteps in the hallway stopped outside the door, and Maya backed toward the bathroom, cradling the baby with one arm while her other hand fumbled for her phone again, and she looked down at the silk and really examined the embroidery for the first time, tracing the lines of the family tree with her eyes, and realized these weren't just decorative branches, these were actual genealogical connections, generations mapped out in thread and blood-colored ink. And at the top of the tree, repeated over and over in different variations, was a single name, Thorn, and beneath it dozens of other names branched out like the descendants of some ancient dynasty. The door handle turned slowly, and Maya watched it rotate in the dim light, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs, and she pressed herself against the bathroom door frame, the baby's cold skin warming slightly against her body heat, and thought about all the times she had been invisible, all the years she had spent being the person no one noticed, the maid who cleaned up after other people's lives without leaving a trace of her own, and wondered if tonight was the night that invisibility would finally fail her. The security camera mounted in the corner of the room had a small red light blinking, recording everything, timestamp reading 11:51, and Maya realized that whatever happened next would be caught on video, would be evidence of her choices, and she had to decide right now whether she was going to be the person who ran or the person who stayed, the person who called the authorities like she was supposed to, or the person who listened to her gut and protected this cold, strange baby with the too slow heartbeat and the eyes that looked at her like she was the only safe thing in a hostile world. The baby's fingers curled around a fold of her uniform shirt, grip surprisingly strong for something so small, and Maya felt the weight of that tiny hand like an anchor, and she knew with sudden clarity that she was not going to call 911. She was not going to hand this child over to strangers. She was going to wait and see who came through that door and what they wanted, and whether her instincts about protection were right, or whether she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Outside, the rain hammered harder, and the parking lot lights flickered again, throwing shadows across the room, and the doorknob stopped turning, and in the silence that followed, Maya could hear her own breathing, fast and shallow, and the baby's breathing, slow and steady, and somewhere in the distance the sound of someone walking away down the hallway, footsteps fading. And she realized whoever had been outside the door had chosen not to enter, had chosen to wait. And that terrified her more than anything because it meant they were patient, they were planning, and they knew she wasn't going anywhere. Maya had made her decision in room 13 to wait and see who came for the baby, but standing in the stairwell at 12:03 in the morning with a man stepping out of the shadows like something from a nightmare, she wondered if her instincts had finally led her somewhere she could not escape. The man was tall and pale in a way that seemed wrong. Not sickly pale, but marble pale, like his skin had never seen sunlight and never would, and he wore a charcoal coat that probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months, perfectly tailored, not a wrinkle or speck of dust anywhere on the fabric. His eyes caught the green glow of the emergency exit sign above the door and reflected it back like an animal's eyes in headlights, flat and bright and utterly inhuman, and when he spoke, his voice was smooth and controlled and absolutely certain. "The child is mine," he said, not asked, just stated it like a fact of physics. "Give him to me." Maya took a step backward, her spine hitting the concrete wall of the stairwell, and the baby in her arms started to wail, a sound of pure distress that echoed off the walls and made her ears ring. And she saw something change in the man's face, saw his whole body go rigid like he had been struck, and his eyes widened just a fraction before he caught himself and smoothed his expression back to that calm mask. She held the baby tighter and said, "Show me identification. Prove you are who you say you are." And her voice came out steadier than she felt, years of customer service training kicking in to give her a script when her own words failed. The man reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, like he understood sudden movements would make her run, and pulled out a photograph, edges worn like it had been handled many times, and held it out for her to see. The image showed him holding a newborn baby in what looked like a hospital room, sterile white walls and medical equipment visible in the background. And there was a timestamp in the corner that read July 3rd, 2025. And Maya's eyes went to the man's face in the photo, and then to his face in front of her, and they were identical, not aged even slightly in the 4 months between then and now. She looked back at the photograph and noticed something that made her stomach turn over. Noticed that behind the man in the image, there was a window, and in that window, she could see the reflection of the baby and the hospital bed and the IV stand, but no reflection of the man himself, just empty space where he should have been. The baby's wailing had settled into hiccuping sobs, and Maya looked down at the tiny face and then back up at the stranger and said, "I am not giving you this child without legal verification, without police involvement, without something more than a photograph that proves exactly nothing except that you knew this baby existed 4 months ago." The man's jaw tightened, and he said, "My name is Cassius Thorne. I am bound by laws you do not understand. If human authorities take him, I cannot reclaim him without breaking a treaty that keeps this city from becoming a graveyard." And there was something in his voice when he said graveyard that made Maya believe he meant it literally, that he was talking about bodies and blood and violence on a scale she could not comprehend. He pulled a wallet from his coat and extracted a stack of bills, all hundreds, and held them out to her and said $50,000 cash. "Walk away now and forget you ever saw him. Everyone can be bought, and I am trying to respect your time by offering you a fair price." Maya stared at the money and felt something hot and furious rise up in her chest, something that had been building for 3 years of cleaning up after people who treated her like furniture, and she said, "You think I can be bought? You think that is what this is about?" And Cassius looked at her with those strange reflective eyes and said, "Everyone can. I am trying to respect your time." And his certainty made her want to scream. She shifted the baby to her other arm and said, "What are you?" Because that seemed like the question that mattered most, the question that would explain the missing reflection and the too pale skin, and the way he moved like gravity affected him differently than it affected normal people. He did not answer directly, just said, "I am his father. That is all that matters." But before Maya could respond, the baby made a soft sound and reached out one tiny hand toward Cassius, fingers grasping at air, and Cassius went very still, and then slowly, like he was afraid of breaking something precious, extended his index finger toward that reaching hand. The baby's fingers closed around Cassius's finger and held on, and Maya saw Cassius's hand tremble, saw his whole arm shake with some emotion she could not name, and he closed his eyes for just a moment and took a breath that sounded like pain. first tactile contact in 127 days, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. I thought him dead. I thought I had lost everything. Maya felt her certainty crack, felt the absolute conviction that this man was a monster start to splinter into something more complicated, because she could see his hands shaking, and she could hear the grief in his voice, and the baby was holding on to him like he recognized something, some biological connection that transcended logic. She said, I will go with you to verify your claim, but I am calling a friend to track my location. If anything happens to me, someone will know where I went. And Cassius opened his eyes and looked at her, and nodded once, and said, That is acceptable. They walked to the parking lot in silence, Maya carrying the baby wrapped in his strange silk, and Cassius walking beside her with his hands in his coat pockets. And when they reached his car, it was a black sedan that looked expensive but not ostentatious, clean lines and dark windows, and Cassius opened the passenger door for her like this was a normal evening and not the strangest night of Maya's life. She settled into the leather seat with the baby in her lap and noticed there was no GPS unit on the dashboard, no phone mount, no evidence of modern navigation technology. And when Cassius started the engine, classical music began to play, harpsichord and strings, baroque compositions that sounded like they belonged in a museum. He drove exactly the speed limit, through empty Portland streets, never accelerating through yellow lights, never taking corners too fast, moving through traffic laws, like someone who had memorized rules but did not feel their purpose. Maya watched the bridges slide past outside her window, lights reflecting on the Willamette River. And she said, Why is the mother not here? Where is she? Cassius's jaw tightened and his hands flexed on the steering wheel, and he said, Alara died protecting him. The people who killed her wanted to use Nikolai as a weapon against me. She hid him where I would never think to search, among humans I had never noticed. You did not notice a whole motel, Maya said. And Cassius glanced at her, and there was something almost like respect in his eyes when he said, I did not notice you either. That was her genius. They drove through the Pearl District and pulled into an underground garage beneath a building that was all glass and steel and modern luxury, and Cassius parked in a spot marked reserved and led Maya to an elevator that required a keycard to operate. The ride up was silent, except for the baby's soft breathing and the mechanical hum of cables, and when the doors opened, they stepped directly into a penthouse that made Maya catch her breath despite herself. White marble floors stretched in every direction, reflecting the floor-to-ceiling windows that showed Portland spread out below like a constellation of lights. And the furniture was minimal and expensive, all clean lines and neutral colors, and the whole space felt cold and sterile and unlived in, more like a museum exhibit than a home. A man emerged from a side hallway, older than Cassius by appearance, maybe 60, wearing a suit despite the late hour, and Cassius said, This is Gregor, he handles administrative matters. And Gregor nodded to Maya with the kind of polite distance that suggested he had seen many strange things and this barely registered. Gregor gestured to a glass table where several documents were laid out in neat rows, and he said in an accent Maya could not place, We have prepared the necessary paperwork for your review, birth certificate for the child, death certificate for the mother, and the custody agreement executed before her death. Maya shifted the baby to one arm and picked up the birth certificate, saw Nikolai Alara Thorne written in careful script, date of birth, July 3rd, 2025, and the paper had all the right seals and stamps, but something about it felt wrong, too perfect, too exact. The death certificate listed Alara Thorne, cause of death accidental fall from Fremont Bridge, date July 10th, 2025, ruled accidental by medical examiner, and Maya thought about a woman jumping or falling or being pushed from a bridge and felt sick. The custody agreement was longer, dense legal language, and Gregor helpfully pointed to a specific clause and read aloud. In the event of my death, Nikolai must be raised with human connection until age 7, ensuring he can choose his nature. And Maya looked up sharply and said, Choose his nature. What does that mean? Cassius had been standing by the windows looking out at the city, and he turned and said, Elara believed choice mattered more than blood. I am trying to honor that, even though it is inconvenient. And there was something raw in his voice that made Maya look at him differently. Gregor produced another document and said, This is a contract for your services as human liaison for 72 hours. Payment of $100,000 upon completion. Your role is to verify that the child's needs are met according to the terms set forth by his mother, and if you refuse, then Mr. Thorne must surrender the child to Vampire Court, where he will be raised as a political asset. Maya's brain stuttered on the word vampire, on the casual way Gregor said it like it was a normal job title. And she looked at Cassius and said, Vampire Court. And Cassius met her eyes and said, Yes, we exist. We have laws, and this child is valuable to people who would use him to hurt me. I need you to help me keep him safe. The baby stirred in Maya's arms and made a small sound, and she looked down at the pale skin and slow heartbeat, and realized it all made a terrible kind of sense. The cold touch and the strange silk embroidered with family trees and blood-colored thread, and the mother who had hidden her half-human son in a budget motel because she knew the vampires would never look there. She thought about walking away, about going back to her small apartment and her minimum wage job and her invisible life. And then she thought about this baby being raised as a weapon, being used by people who saw him as a tool instead of a child. And she knew she could not let that happen. She said, I will do it. 72 hours. But I am not doing this for your money. I am doing this for him. And Cassius nodded slowly and said, I understand. And Maya wondered if he really did. If someone who had lived for centuries could understand what it meant to be powerless and invisible and desperate to matter. Gregor handed her a pen and she signed the contract with shaking hands, and through a doorway she could see another room, smaller and warmer than the rest of the penthouse, with soft lighting and a hand-carved wooden crib and a mobile hanging above it, shaped like stars. And she realized that was Nikolai's nursery, that despite everything else, Cassius had prepared a space that looked like love. Maya woke on the guest room couch with morning light cutting through unfamiliar windows, and the immediate disorientation of someone who had fallen asleep in their clothes in a place that was not home. And for a moment she did not remember where she was or why her neck hurt from the angle of the cushions, until she turned her head and saw the portable crib beside the couch and the baby inside it, awake and silent and watching her with those dark eyes that seemed far too aware for an infant. She had refused the bedroom Gregor had offered, had insisted on the couch instead because sleeping in a bed felt like surrendering some essential vigilance. Like if she got too comfortable in this marble palace, she might forget that she was here for a job and not as a guest. And now her back ached, and her mouth tasted like copper, and the baby was staring at her without making a sound. Nikolai, she reminded herself, his name is Nikolai, not the baby, not it. And she sat up slowly and looked at him and whispered, Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep? And he blinked at her but did not cry or coo or make any of the normal baby noises she vaguely remembered from her cousin's kids. A knock on the door made her jump, and Gregor entered carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like toast, and he set it down on the glass side table and said in his careful formal way that Mr. Thorne was in a council session and would return by noon. And Maya picked up the coffee and took a sip, and tried not to think about what a vampire council session might involve. She said, I need to take Nikolai to a pediatrician. He has not eaten in over 12 hours and I do not know how to feed him properly. And Gregor's expression shifted into something that might have been disapproval, and he said the Vampire King does not require human medical intervention. The child's needs can be managed internally. But Maya cut him off before he could finish and said the contract says human connection. That includes human doctors. Unless you want me to report to whatever vampire court handles these things, that you are already violating the terms. Gregor looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him recalculate something behind his eyes, saw him realize that she was not going to be as compliant as he had assumed, and he said, Very well, I will arrange transportation. Lydia will accompany you for security purposes. Lydia turned out to be a young woman who looked maybe 25 with dark hair and an eager expression, and she drove Maya and Nikolai to a pediatric clinic in northwest Portland in a car that smelled like leather and expensive air freshener, and the whole drive Lydia asked questions about human customs like she was conducting an anthropology study. Questions about why people put bumper stickers on cars and whether coffee really tasted good or if humans just drank it out of habit. The clinic was in a converted house with pastel walls and furniture designed to look cheerful, and Maya signed in under Nikolai's name and sat in the waiting room holding him while he remained eerily still and quiet. And when the nurse called them back, Maya felt her stomach tighten with anxiety about what the doctor would find. Dr. Patel was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and efficient hands, and she took Nikolai from Maya and laid him on the examination table and began her assessment with the calm competence of someone who had done this thousands of times, checking his eyes and ears and reflexes, and then she frowned and pulled out a thermometer and took his temperature and frowned harder. His temperature is 94 degrees, she said, and his heart rate is 40 beats per minute. I need to admit him to the hospital immediately. This child is in medical distress. Maya felt panic slam into her chest because if Nikolai went to a hospital, there would be questions and tests, and eventually someone would figure out that his blood was not entirely human, and then authorities would get involved. And Cassius had said very clearly that human authorities taking Nikolai would break some treaty that kept Portland from becoming a graveyard, and Maya did not want to be responsible for whatever that meant. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and texted Cassius, "Doctor wants to hospitalize him. What do I do?" And the response came back in seconds, "Leave now. I will handle the doctor." But Maya looked at Dr. Patel, who was already reaching for the phone to call an ambulance, and she knew running would only make things worse, would only make them look guilty of something. She said, "Wait, please. He has a rare condition. I need to consult his specialist before we admit him." And Dr. Patel turned to look at her with skepticism clear on her face and said, "What rare condition?" And Maya's mind went blank because she had no idea what excuse would explain a child with hypothermia and bradycardia who was otherwise alert and responsive. Dr. Patel said, "I cannot in good conscience release this child without proper medical evaluation. If there is a specialist, you need to get them here now." And Maya nodded and said, "1 hour. Please just give me 1 hour." And stepped out into the hallway and called Cassius instead of texting. He answered on the first ring, and she said, "The doctor will not let us leave. She wants to admit him. You need to get here now." And he said, "I am coming," and the line went dead. Maya went back into the examination room and told Dr. Patel that the specialist was on his way, and Dr. Patel agreed to wait, but kept checking her watch and looking at Nikolai with increasing concern. And Maya sat in the plastic chair and held the baby, and felt time stretch out like taffy, every minute lasting an hour. Cassius arrived in 11 minutes, and Maya heard his voice in the hallway before she saw him, calm and authoritative and speaking to the receptionist. And then he was in the examination room in his charcoal coat and perfect composure, and Dr. Patel was looking at him with the wariness of someone who recognized wealth and power when she saw it. He introduced himself as Nikolai's father and a private physician, and he pulled documents from his coat pocket, medical records on official letterhead diagnosing Nikolai with hereditary hypothermic bradycardia, a condition characterized by chronically low body temperature and heart rate due to mitochondrial dysfunction, managed with specialized nutrition and monitoring. And Maya watched Dr. Patel read the papers with a frown. "This is not a recognized condition," Dr. Patel said. "I have never heard of this diagnosis." And Cassius said calmly that it was extremely rare, fewer than 100 documented cases worldwide, and the research was still emerging. But his son was under the care of specialists in Seattle who had developed a treatment protocol. Dr. Patel looked between Cassius and Maya and Nikolai, and Maya could see her trying to decide if this was legitimate or if she was looking at a case of medical neglect or something worse. And finally she said, "I am not comfortable releasing this child without verification from these specialists. I need contact information." and Cassius provided a phone number and email address that Maya knew would lead to more fabricated documents and more lies. Dr. Patel made notes and said she would be following up, and legally she could not hold the baby without evidence of abuse or imminent danger, so she released them with visible reluctance and instructions to return immediately if his condition worsened. Maya carried Nikolai out of the clinic with Cassius beside her and Lydia trailing behind, and none of them spoke until they reached the parking lot where rain was starting to fall in that fine gray drizzle that Portland specialized in, and Maya stopped walking and turned to face Cassius and said, "You can fake documents and control people, but you cannot actually keep him safe in the human world, can you?" Cassius stood in the rain without an umbrella, and Maya watched his coat begin to darken with moisture, watched drops collect in his hair, and his careful mask cracked, and something raw showed through when he said no. "That is why Alara's claws terrifies me. I can protect him from vampires. I have the resources and the power, and the centuries of experience to navigate our world, but I cannot protect him from exposure in yours. I cannot make human doctors accept impossible vital signs. I cannot prevent questions I have no legitimate answers for." Maya shifted Nikolai in her arms and felt the weight of what he was saying settle over her like a physical thing, felt the power dynamic between them shift and rebalance, and she said then, "We are partners, not employer and employee, partners, because you need me to navigate the human world the same way I need you to navigate yours." Cassius looked at her, and rain ran down his face, and he was silent for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with the idea of partnership, with the concept of needing someone he had known for less than 12 hours, someone he could not buy or control, or intimidate into compliance, and finally he said agreed. They drove back to the penthouse in silence, and Maya sat in the back seat with Nikolai, and looked out at Portland sliding past in shades of gray and green, and she started humming without thinking about it, some melody from childhood that she did not remember learning. And Nikolai made a sound, a soft cooing noise, that was the first vocalization she had heard from him besides crying, and she looked down and saw him watching her face with something that might have been contentment. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Cassius disappeared into his office, and Maya took Nikolai to the nursery, that one warm room in the otherwise sterile space, and she sat in the rocking chair and held him, and thought about how 12 hours ago she had been a hotel maid cleaning room 13, and now she was partners with a vampire king trying to protect a half-human baby from forces she barely understood. And the absurdity of it should have made her laugh, except it was too real, too immediate, too weighted with consequence. Gregor brought her a bottle of the specialized formula mixed with something he called donor blood, warmed to body temperature, and she fed Nikolai and watched him drink with those slow, deliberate movements, and thought about Dr. Patel's face when she took his temperature, thought about how close they had come to disaster, thought about how many more disasters waited in the next 60 hours. When Cassius finally emerged from his office, he found her still in the nursery, and he stood in the doorway and said, "I underestimated you," and Maya said, "I know," and he said, "I am not accustomed to needing people, to relying on anyone for anything," and Maya said, "I know that too. But if we are going to keep him safe, you need to start learning." And Cassius nodded slowly and said, "Teach me." And Maya realized that was the most vulnerable thing he had said to her, more vulnerable than his confession in the parking lot, because it was an admission not just of limitation, but of willingness to change. Maya followed Cassius and Gregor into the study at 2 in the afternoon, Nikolai asleep in her arms after finally taking a full bottle of the specialized formula, and she could tell from the tension in Cassius's shoulders that whatever Gregor had to report was not good news. Gregor laid a formal document on the desk, heavy paper with an embossed seal that looked like it belonged in a medieval archive, and he said, "House Corvus has filed a formal challenge in Vampire Court. Magistrate Voss is claiming Mr. Thorne is unfit to raise the child because Alara's death violated the Rose City Pact, the treaty that prevents vampire-on-vampire violence within city limits." Maya sat down carefully, adjusting Nikolai against her shoulder, and said, "What does that mean?" And Cassius turned from the window where he had been staring out at the city, and said it means Voss is arguing that I caused or allowed Alara's death, and therefore should be disqualified from guardianship, and that he should be appointed regent until Nikolai comes of age. The hearing is set for November 8th at midnight, Gregor added, which gives us 34 hours to prove both that you can meet Alara's terms regarding human connection and that you did not violate the pact. Maya looked at Cassius and asked the question that had been building since she first read Alara's death certificate: how did she die? And Cassius's jaw tightened, and he said she fell from the Fremont Bridge. Ruled accidental. It was not. Who killed her? Maya asked, and Cassius met her eyes and said, I do not know. But Voss benefits most from the uncertainty. If I am ruled unfit, he gains control of Nikolai, and by extension, gains leverage over me and everyone else who might oppose him. Maya thought about a woman falling from a bridge, thought about whether she jumped or was pushed or fought for her life in those final moments, and she held Nikolai closer and said, so we prove you did not kill her, and we prove you can honor her wishes. And Cassius nodded, but his expression suggested he thought both tasks might be impossible. The afternoon passed in tense planning, Gregor making calls to vampire court officials and Cassius reviewing legal precedents that dated back centuries. And Maya sat in the nursery with Nikolai and tried not to think about the clock ticking down toward midnight tomorrow. At 6:30 she stood up and said, Nikolai needs fresh air. He needs to see something besides these walls. And Cassius looked at her like she had suggested walking into a war zone and said, it is not safe. Voss has allies everywhere. Maya said the contract requires human connection and normal childhood experiences. You cannot keep him locked in a penthouse forever. And Cassius studied her face and finally nodded and said, Lydia will accompany you. Do not go far. Do not stay long. They went to Tom McCall Waterfront Park as dusk was settling over the city. Nikolai bundled in a stroller that Lydia had produced from some storage closet. And for 20 minutes, Maya walked along the path beside the Willamette River and pretended this was normal. Pretended she was just a woman taking a baby for an evening walk and not a hotel maid turned vampire liaison trying to protect a half-human child from supernatural politics. She stopped at a vendor selling handmade toys and bought a small stuffed otter, soft gray fabric with black button eyes, and tucked it into the stroller beside Nikolai, and he reached for it with one small hand and held on. Lydia was scanning the park with the alertness of someone trained for security work, and Maya was watching Nikolai explore the texture of the otter's fur when Lydia suddenly went rigid and said, we have a problem. Maya looked up and saw a man across the plaza, pointing a camera in their direction, and Lydia was already moving toward him, vampire speed making her cross the distance in seconds that should have taken minutes, and Maya heard her say in a low voice, you need to delete that photo now. The man was already backing away, phone in hand, and he said, I am a freelance journalist. This is a public space. I have every right to take photographs. And Maya's stomach sank, because she recognized the tone of someone who knew exactly what story he had just captured. Lydia reported back that the man had recognized Cassius from a society page feature 2 years ago, had seen them together, and assumed this was a scoop about the reclusive billionaire's secret family, and the photo was already uploaded to 3 different gossip blogs with the headline, Reclusive Billionaire Cassius Thorne, Spotted, with mystery woman and baby. Cassius called Maya's phone before they even made it back to the car, his voice tight with controlled fury, and he said, get back here now. And Maya could hear in his tone that he was angry, not at her, but at himself for underestimating how fast human media could move. In the car driving back, Maya looked down at Nikolai and saw he was still clutching the stuffed otter, his fingers wrapped around one of its flippers, and she realized it was the first object he had held on to besides the silk he had been wrapped in when she found him. By the time they reached the penthouse, the story had been picked up by local news blogs, and the speculation was already spinning out of control. Secret family, surrogate scandal, mysterious nanny, And Maya's face was visible in every version of the photo, even though her name was not mentioned yet. She sat in the guest room at 11 that night, staring at her phone as it buzzed with a call from Carol, her supervisor at the Budget Star Motel. And when she answered, Carol's voice was sharp with anger, saying, "Are you involved with a guest? Are you having some kind of relationship with a client? Because I just saw your face all over the internet with some rich man, and this is grounds for immediate termination." Maya tried to explain, but the words stuck in her throat because how could she say she was protecting a vampire baby from supernatural politics? How could she make any of this sound rational? And Carol did not wait for an explanation. Just said, "You are fired effective immediately, turn in your keycard by the end of the week," and hung up. Maya sat there holding her silent phone and felt the bottom drop out of her world. Felt the loss of her job and her routine and her anonymity hit her all at once. And she thought about how 3 days ago she had been invisible, and now her face was on gossip blogs, and she had no income and no way to go back to the life she had known. Cassius found her 20 minutes later still sitting in the dark, and she expected him to tell her she was now a liability, expected him to offer her money to leave and disappear. But instead, he sat down across from her and said, "I am sorry, this is my fault. I will compensate you for your lost income." And Maya cut him off and said, "I do not want your money for this. I want to know if Nikolai is worth it. If all of this chaos and danger and loss is worth it for one baby." Cassius was silent for a long time, and Maya watched his face in the dim light from the hallway and saw something raw and unguarded move across his features before he said, "He is all I have left of her, and he is the only innocent thing I have ever been responsible for in 800 years. So yes, he is worth everything." Maya felt something settle in her chest, some decision clicking into place, and she said, "Okay, then we finish this." And Cassius looked at her with what might have been gratitude or respect or something she did not have a name for. She could not sleep after that, her mind too full of questions and fears and the strange unreality of everything that had happened since she opened room 13. And at 3 in the morning she gave up on rest and walked through the dark penthouse until she found Cassius standing in the nursery, silhouetted against the window with the city lights behind him, watching Nikolai sleep in his crib. Maya stopped in the doorway and asked, "Did you love her, Alara?" And Cassius did not turn, but his shoulders shifted slightly, and he said, "I did not believe I could love until I met her. She was vampire, but she had spent decades among humans, and she saw the world differently. She made me curious." "About what?" Maya asked, stepping into the room. And Cassius said, "About what I had missed. I have lived 800 years, and I stopped noticing small things centuries ago, stopped seeing wonder in ordinary moments, but Alara noticed everything. The way light moved through water, the sound of a baby laughing, the taste of rain, and she wanted Nikolai to have that capacity for wonder." Maya moved to stand beside him, both of them looking down at the sleeping baby, and she said, "He will have it. We will make sure." And Cassius turned to look at her directly, with no mask and no armor, and asked, "Why are you helping me? You owe me nothing. You could have walked away a dozen times and chosen safety." Maya thought about her own childhood, about being alone and invisible and desperate for someone to notice she existed. And she said, "I owe him. Nobody helped me when I needed it, and I am not letting that happen to him." And Cassius nodded slowly, like he understood something about her that she had never spoken aloud. They stood there in the warm glow of the nursery while the city slept outside, and Maya felt the distance between them shift into something that was not quite friendship, but was more than alliance, something built on shared grief and shared purpose, and the weight of protecting one small life against forces neither of them fully controlled. Gregor found them at 8 in the morning, both of them exhausted and still in the same clothes from the day before, and his face was grim when he said, "Magistrate Voss has escalated. He has leaked the story to a major news outlet with a journalist on his payroll," and he handed them a tablet showing the headline, "Billionaire Cassius Thorne's secret baby did he abduct a child? The article used the photo from the park and included quotes from anonymous sources saying, "Thorne has a history of making people disappear. Someone should investigate," and Maya felt rage rise hot in her throat because she could see exactly what Voss was doing, weaponizing human systems against Cassius the same way Cassius had once used vampire law to control situations, turning the tables and forcing them to fight on two fronts simultaneously. If Child Protective Services investigates, Nikolai will be removed from the home, Gregor said. And if Vampire Court rules against Mr. Thorne, the child becomes Voss's ward, and we have 16 hours until the hearing. Maya looked at Cassius and saw him calculating probabilities and coming up empty, saw him facing a problem that could not be solved with money or influence or centuries of accumulated power, and she said, "We need proof that Voss is behind Alara's death. If he violated the pact by killing her, then he is disqualified too. We turn his own strategy against him." Cassius met her eyes, and something sharp and fierce moved across his face, something that reminded Maya he had not always been restrained by treaties and rules, and he said yes. And Maya realized they were done playing defense. They were going to war. Maya and Cassius sat across from each other in the study at 10 in the morning, with Gregor standing beside them, presenting what he called a lead. And Maya felt the exhaustion of the past 48 hours pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. But she forced herself to focus on what Gregor was saying about Alara's personal effects being stored in a vampire archive. One item was never examined, Gregor said, her phone, because Vampire Court assumed human technology would be irrelevant to the case. But if there is evidence on that device, it could change everything. Maya said we need to get it now, and Cassius explained that the archive was neutral ground overseen by a third faction called House Silent. They could access it, but only if they went in person and followed strict protocol. And they had 14 hours until the hearing, which meant they needed to move immediately. Maya looked toward the nursery where Nikolai was sleeping and said, "I do not want to leave him." And Cassius said Gregor and Lydia will protect him with their lives. Babies cannot infiltrate archives, and Maya knew he was right, but the thought of being separated from Nikolai made her chest tighten with anxiety. She did not entirely understand. They left the penthouse at noon and drove to the Benson Hotel, a historic Portland landmark with ornate architecture that spoke of old money and older secrets, and Cassius led her through the lobby and down a service staircase that descended far deeper than any normal basement should go, the air getting colder with each step until Maya could see her breath. The archive was a vast chamber of marble and iron, lit by gaslight that cast flickering shadows across rows of shelves holding boxes and scrolls and objects that looked like they belonged in museums. And standing in the center of the space was a figure Cassius addressed as Silence, an ancient vampire whose gender Maya could not determine and whose eyes were pale as frost. Silence granted them 30 minutes, no more, and gestured to a section of shelves marked with Alara's name in flowing script. They found her box on a high shelf, and Cassius lifted it down with careful hands, and inside were the remnants of a life cut short. A phone with a cracked screen, a leather journal, a silk scarf that matched the fabric Nikolai had been wrapped in, and a silver ring engraved with coordinates that Maya did not recognize. She picked up the phone and tried to turn it on, but the battery was dead, years of storage having drained whatever charge it once held, and Cassius moved to a drawer labeled Modern Conveniences and pulled out a charging cable, and the absurdity of finding USB-C cables next to medieval scrolls made Maya want to laugh, except nothing about this situation was funny. While the phone charged, Maya opened the journal, pages filled with Alara's handwriting, elegant loops and careful thoughts, entries about Nikolai's first smile, and Cassius's slow transformation from distant to devoted, and fears about what the future held. The final entry was dated July 9th, 2025, the day before Alara died, and Maya read the words with shaking hands. "Voss knows about Nikolai," Alara had written. "He thinks C will use him as leverage against rival houses. He is wrong. N is not a weapon. He is a choice. If I die choosing love over fear. See, forgive me for hiding him. Trust the human who finds him. She will see what we could not. Maya read that line 3 times. Trust the human who finds him. She will see what we could not. And felt the weight of prophecy settle over her like a cloak. Felt Ilara reaching across death to tell her that this moment had been planned. That Maya's discovery of Nikolai in room 13 was not accident but design. The phone screen lit up, battery climbing to 5%, and Maya unlocked it using the passcode Cassius provided and went straight to the messages. The last conversation was with an unknown number, and Maya read Ilara's words, "I will not let you use him," and the response that came back, "Then you are a traitor to your blood," and the timestamp read, July 10th, 2025, 9:47 p.m., exactly 1 hour before the medical examiner estimated Ilara had fallen from the Fremont Bridge. Maya took screenshots of everything, hands trembling, and Cassius watched over her shoulder and said, "That is motive, but not proof. We need to trace that number." And Maya nodded and tucked the phone into her pocket, as silence appeared to tell them their 30 minutes were complete. They drove back to the penthouse in silence, Maya clutching Ilara's journal against her chest, and when they arrived, Gregor was waiting with a laptop and the technical skills to trace the burner phone number from the text messages. The number was registered to a prepaid account purchased with cash, no name attached, but cell tower data showed it had pinged near the Fremont Bridge at 10:52 p.m. on July 10th, 5 minutes after Ilara's last text, and right around the time she would have died. "It is circumstantial," Gregor said. "Not enough to convict anyone in vampire court. You need a witness or a confession." And Maya looked at Cassius and said, "What if we bluff? What if we present this evidence at the hearing and force Voss to react, let him incriminate himself?" Cassius studied her face and said, "If we accuse Voss without absolute proof and fail, he will retaliate against you." And Maya said, "He already leaked a story calling you a kidnapper. I am already a target." And Cassius was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You are not what I expected." "Neither are you," Maya replied. And she meant it. Meant that 3 days ago she would never have imagined trusting a vampire king with anything that mattered. But now she was trusting him with her safety and her future and the life of a child who had become more important to her than her own survival. The afternoon stretched into evening, and Maya spent time with Nikolai while Cassius worked in his office preparing legal arguments for the hearing. And she fed the baby his specialized formula mixed with warmed donor blood, Gregor's compromise that gave Nikolai the nutrition his half-vampire body needed while still honoring the human half of his heritage. Nikolai drank slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Maya's face, and when he finished, he fell asleep in her arms with the stuffed otter tucked against his chest, and Maya sat in the rocking chair and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her that she had never experienced before. Cassius entered the nursery quietly and stood watching them, and Maya looked up and asked, "Does it scare you? That he might choose to be human when he is older? That Ilara's clause means he could walk away from your world entirely?" Cassius sat in the chair across from her and was silent for long enough that Maya thought he might not answer, and then he said, "Yes. It terrifies me, because I will not be able to follow him there. I cannot become human. I cannot age alongside him or share a mortal life." But Ilara was right. He deserves the choice. He deserves to decide who and what he wants to be. The silence stretched between them, weighted with things neither of them knew how to say, and then Cassius added, "You would be a good mother." And Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks and said, "I am not. I am just helping." But Cassius shook his head and said, "You are doing more than that. You are choosing him the way Ilara chose him, the way I am trying to choose him." And Maya realized he was right, that somewhere in the past 3 days she had stopped thinking of Nikolai as a job or an obligation and started thinking of him as hers to protect. The moment stretched and deepened, awareness crackling in the air between them, And then Nikolai stirred and made a soft sound, and the spell broke. And Cassius stood and said we should prepare. The hearing starts at midnight. Maya changed into formal clothes that Lydia had somehow procured, a simple black dress that fit perfectly and made her feel like someone other than a hotel maid. And when she emerged from the guest room, Cassius was waiting in a charcoal suit with silver cufflinks, looking every inch the king he was, and he held out a small iron pendant on a delicate chain. "Wear this," he said. "It marks you as under my protection. If anything happens, the pendant will summon Gregor, and he will get you out." Maya took it and said nothing will happen. And Cassius said if it does, I need to know you are safe. And she understood that he was afraid not just for Nikolai but for her. That she had become someone he cared about beyond her utility. And she put on the pendant and felt the weight of it settle against her sternum like a promise. They stood at the penthouse door, and Cassius said quietly, "Thank you, for seeing him, for seeing me." And Maya said, "We are finishing this together." And they left. Pioneer Courthouse was a grand building of stone and history, one of Portland's oldest federal structures. And as they entered, Maya saw that the main chamber had been transformed for the hearing, lit by lanterns instead of electric lights, filled with vampires in formal attire who turned to watch them enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Magistrate Voss stood near the front, silver-haired and immaculate in a black suit. And when his eyes flicked to Maya, they were dismissive, like she was furniture or decoration, something beneath his notice. The presiding judge was an ancient vampire named Corinth, who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had lived millennia, and when Corinth called the session to order, the room fell silent with the weight of ritual and law. Voss presented his case with practiced eloquence, arguing that Cassius had violated the Rose City Pact by allowing Alara's death to occur, that his fraternization with a human demonstrated he could not be trusted to honor vampire tradition, that Nikolai should be placed under the regency of House Corvus until he reached maturity. The words were smooth and reasonable and utterly damning, and Maya felt anger burn hot in her chest as she listened to Voss paint Cassius as negligent and dangerous. Corinth turned to Cassius and asked for his response, and Cassius stood and presented Alara's journal and the screenshots from her phone, laying out the timeline of threatening texts and cell tower data that placed Voss's burner phone near the bridge at the time of Alara's death. He accused Voss of murder, of violating the pact he claimed to defend, and the chamber erupted in murmurs and whispers. Voss laughed, the sound echoing off marble walls, and said, "This is circumstantial at best. I was at a gala that night with 50 witnesses who can attest to my presence. And even if that phone was near the bridge, I loaned it to an associate. I have no knowledge of its use." The murmurs grew louder, vampires weighing the evidence and finding it insufficient. And Maya saw Cassius's jaw tighten and knew they were losing. Then Maya stood, her chair scraping against stone, and every eye in the chamber turned to her, and she felt the weight of centuries of vampire law and tradition pressing down on her human shoulders. But she did not sit down. She addressed Corinth directly and said, "I am the human who found Nikolai. Alara's journal says she trusted the human who finds him. She planned for this. She knew Voss would come for her son, and she hid him where vampires do not look. Among people you ignore, among humans you consider beneath your notice. I am honoring her wish. And if you rule against Cassius, you are telling every vampire in this room that a mother's dying choice means nothing, that her sacrifice was meaningless, that love is less important than politics." The silence that followed was absolute, hundreds of years of life and death and law held in suspension, and Corinth regarded Maya with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, and said, "You are brave human, or foolish." Maya met that ancient gaze and said, "I am neither. I am just keeping a promise to a woman I never met." And she heard her voice steady and clear and wondered who this person was who could stand in front of vampire royalty and speak without trembling. Corinth was silent for what felt like hours, and then said, "I will render judgment at dawn. Until then, this court is adjourned." and the chamber emptied slowly, vampires filing out into the November night. And Maya stood beside Cassius and felt the pendant warm against her skin and knew that whatever came next, they had done everything they could. Cassius and Maya returned to the penthouse at 12:15 in the morning with the weight of Corinth's pending judgment hanging over them like a storm cloud. And Gregor met them in the foyer with the unexpected news that Nikolai had slept through the night for the first time since Maya had found him. No crying, no distress, just peaceful sleep. They walked together to the nursery and found him still sleeping, the stuffed otter clutched against his chest, and Maya sat in the chair beside the crib while Cassius stood in the doorway watching them both with an expression she could not quite read. "Whatever Corinth decides," Cassius said quietly, "you are free to leave. I will pay you the full contract amount, plus severance for your lost job. You have fulfilled every obligation and more." Maya did not look at him, kept her eyes on Nikolai's sleeping face, and said, "What if I do not want to leave?" And the silence that followed felt heavy with things neither of them knew how to articulate. Cassius said then, "I would ask you to stay, not as an employee, as—" And he trailed off like the right word did not exist in any language he had learned in 800 years. "As what?" Maya asked, and Cassius said, "As someone Nikolai needs, as someone I—" But his phone buzzed before he could finish, and Gregor's message said, "Voss is here downstairs. He demands to speak with you." Maya stood immediately and said, "I am coming with you," and Cassius started to protest, but she cut him off and said, "We are partners, remember?" And he nodded once and led her to the elevator. Voss was waiting in the lobby that served as neutral ground between the building's human and vampire residents, and he looked perfectly composed, smiling like he had already won, and he congratulated Cassius on a spirited defense as though the hearing had been entertainment rather than a battle for a child's future. He offered a deal with the smooth confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. "Withdraw the murder accusation, and I will drop the unfitness challenge. Nikolai can stay with you. We can both walk away from this without further conflict." Cassius said, "You killed Ilara," and Voss shrugged and said, "Prove it." And then his eyes moved to Maya, and something cold slithered through his expression. "The human is charming," he said. Ilara thought humans were precious too. It made her weak, and Maya felt rage rise in her throat, but she kept her voice steady when she said, "You are here because you are worried. Corinth believed me." Voss's smile faltered just slightly, just enough for Maya to know she had hit something true, and he leaned closer and said in a voice low enough that only she and Cassius could hear, "Careful, little maid. You are playing in a world where humans are toys. I could erase you before dawn." Maya's hand went to the iron pendant at her throat, and Cassius moved between them with speed that made the air shimmer, and he said, "Touch her, and I will end you. Pact or no pact," and the words came out with the kind of certainty that made Voss take a step back. Voss laughed, but the sound was forced, and he said, "There it is, the real Cassius Thorne. You would break the treaty for a human you met 2 days ago," and Cassius said yes without hesitation, and Voss regarded him with something that might have been respect or fear or both. "Interesting," Voss said. "Then let us see if Corinth shares your sentimentality." And he left, and Maya watched him go and felt the pendant warm against her skin, where Cassius's protection resided in iron and intent. Maya could not sleep after that, her mind too wired with adrenaline and fear, and the strange intimacy of Cassius saying he would break an 800-year-old treaty to protect her. And at 3 in the morning she gave up on rest and found him standing on the penthouse balcony overlooking the city. The rain had stopped, and stars were visible between gaps in the clouds, and Maya stepped out into the cold air and stood beside him and asked, "What did Voss mean, the real Cassius Thorne?" Cassius did not look at her, kept his eyes on the glowing bridges and sleeping streets, and said, "I was not always restrained. Before the pact I ruled through fear. I made examples of anyone who challenged me. I turned this city into a place where vampires whispered my name like a curse. And then I met Alara, and she showed me there were other ways to protect what mattered. But Voss remembers who I was. He thinks I will revert. Will you? Maya asked. And Cassius turned to face her and said, If you or Nikolai are threatened, yes, without hesitation, I will become everything I was before, and worse. Maya shivered, but not from the cold, and she said that should scare me, and Cassius said, But it does not, making it half question. And Maya said no, because I know you will not hurt him, or me. How can you be certain? Cassius asked. And Maya said, Because you asked. Monsters do not ask, they take. But you have asked me at every step whether I wanted to stay, whether I was willing, whether I trusted you. And that is not what monsters do. They stood in the silence of pre-dawn Portland, and Cassius reached out slowly and tucked a strand of Maya's hair behind her ear, and his hand lingered against her cheek, cold skin against warm, and Maya's breath caught in her throat at the tenderness of the gesture. Then he pulled back and said, We should rest. Corinth will summon us soon. And Maya nodded, but neither of them moved for a long moment, the space between them charged with possibility. Neither was ready to name. Corinth's summons arrived at 6 in the morning, and they returned to Pioneer Courthouse as dawn broke over the city, the sky turning shades of pink and gray that made the old stone building look almost beautiful. Corinth stood in the chamber with the weight of millennia in those ancient eyes, and announced the ruling in a voice that echoed off marble walls. Magistrate Voss's alibi is verified, Corinth said. However, the court finds merit in the assertion that Alara Thorne's wishes must be honored. Cassius Thorne will retain guardianship of Nikolai under the following condition. Maya Chen will serve as court-appointed human liaison for the duration of Nikolai's childhood, ensuring Alara's clause is met. Should she resign or be removed, custody reverts to Vampire Court. Maya felt her eyes widen and heard Voss object immediately. This is absurd. A human has no authority in vampire matters. But Corinth said, A mother's dying wish grants her authority. This ruling is final. And Voss glared at both of them with hatred so pure it was almost physical before he turned and stormed from the chamber. Cassius and Maya stood alone in the empty space, morning light beginning to filter through high windows. And Cassius said, You did not agree to this. And Maya said, I know, but I am not walking away from him. Cassius said, It is a decade commitment. Your entire life will change. You will be bound to vampire court and vampire law, and a world you never asked to be part of. And Maya looked at him and said it. Already changed, the moment I opened room 13. They returned to the penthouse as the city woke around them, and when they entered the nursery, Nikolai was awake and making soft babbling sounds Maya had never heard before. Baby noises that were neither crying nor cooing, but something new, something that suggested healing. Maya picked him up, and he reached for her face with one small hand and patted her cheek, and she laughed. A real laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest. The first genuine laughter she had felt in days or maybe years. Cassius watched them with something unreadable in his expression, something that looked like grief and hope tangled together. And he said quietly, Alara would have liked you. And Maya said, I wish I could have met her. Cassius said, In a way you did. You became what she hoped for. You became the person who could see Nikolai as a child instead of a weapon, who could navigate both worlds without losing yourself in either. They stood in the nursery with golden dawn light streaming through the windows, and Nikolai between them, and Cassius's hand came to rest on Maya's shoulder, a gentle weight that spoke of partnership and promise. And Maya leaned into it just slightly, not enough to cross any line, but enough to acknowledge that lines existed to be crossed eventually. 1 week later, Maya had moved her few possessions into a guest suite on a different floor of the penthouse, her own space that Cassius insisted she needed, and she had enrolled in night classes online, working toward a degree in early childhood education, because Gregor had suggested that if she was going to be responsible for Nikolai's human development, she might as well have the credentials to prove she knew what she was doing. Nikolai was thriving in ways that made Maya's chest ache with something like pride, eating better, sleeping through most nights, making more sounds and showing more personality, and she spent her afternoons reading to him from picture books while Cassius worked in his office managing whatever it was Vampire Kings managed. Gregor found her in the nursery that afternoon and said an envelope had arrived addressed to her, no return address, and Maya took it with hands that trembled slightly because anonymous mail in a vampire's home felt like it should be treated with suspicion. Inside was a single photograph, the edges worn like it had been handled many times, and it showed Alara holding newborn Nikolai in what looked like the same hospital room from the photo Cassius had shown Maya that first night. Alara was smiling at the camera, her face luminous with joy and love, and the kind of hope that transcends fear. And on the back in flowing handwriting were the words, "To the one who finds him, thank you for choosing love," signed with the initial E. Maya's eyes filled with tears she did not try to stop, and Cassius appeared in the doorway and read the inscription over her shoulder and said she knew, somehow she knew this would happen. Maya wiped her eyes and said, or she hoped, and hope was enough. Hope that someone would find Nikolai and see him as worth protecting. Hope that love would be stronger than politics. Hope that her son would have the choice she was dying to give him. They looked at each other in the warm nursery light, and the moment stretched and deepened, weighted with everything they had been through, and everything still unspoken between them. And then Nikolai dropped the picture book he had been grasping and made a sound that was unmistakably a giggle, pure baby laughter, that shattered the solemnity of the moment. Maya and Cassius both turned to him, smiling, and Maya picked him up and spun him gently while he laughed, and Cassius watched them with an expression that suggested he was memorizing this moment, storing it away as proof that hope could in fact be enough. The camera of Maya's consciousness pulled back, widening the frame to include all three of them in the nursery, Nikolai in Maya's arms, and Cassius standing close enough to be part of the picture, and through the windows, the city glowed in afternoon light, and on the table the photograph of Alara remained, her smile watching over the family she had created through sacrifice and foresight, and the kind of love that reaches beyond death. The story could end here, with safety achieved and connection forged, and the promise of a future they would build together. But Maya knew that Voss was still out there, that the photograph's arrival raised questions about who had delivered it, and why, and whether Alara had somehow arranged for it to appear at exactly this moment. And she knew that Nikolai's choice was still years away, that the clause Alara had fought for would eventually require her son to decide between worlds. But for now, they had this, they had each other. They had survived, and that was enough.